The story of the Astor Bloodline is not merely a chronicle of accumulation, but a haunting odyssey through the very soul of the American dream. A dream that, for this particular dynasty, often veered into the territory of a gilded nightmare. To understand the gravity of the Astor name, one must look past the shimmering facades of Fifth Avenue and the marble corridors of their vanished palaces, and instead peer into the cold, calculated ambition of a German butcher's son who arrived in a fledgling New York City with nothing but 7 flutes and an insatiable hunger for permanence. John Jacob Astor did not just build a fortune. He constructed a blueprint for American aristocracy, transforming the raw, untamed wilderness of the fur trade into a concrete empire of real estate that would eventually earn him the title of New York's landlord. His methodology was surgical, devoid of the sentimentalities that governed his contemporaries, as he recognized early on that while fashions in fur might fade, the dirt beneath a growing metropolis was the only true path to eternal wealth. However, this foundation was laid with a ruthless hand, creating a psychological inheritance of coldness and detachment that would ripple through 4 generations, manifesting as a profound inability to find peace amidst unimaginable plenty. As the 19th century progressed, the family became the ultimate arbiters of social standing. Yet this public triumph masked a private reality defined by bitter internecine feuds, most notably the legendary War of the Houses between Caroline Astor, the formidable Mrs. Astor, who ruled the 400, and her nephew William Waldorf Astor. This rivalry did not just produce architectural marvels like the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel. It fractured the family's identity, sending William Waldorf into a self-imposed exile in England, where he sought to purchase the history and titles that American money could never quite provide. The tragedy of the Astors lies in this constant, desperate search for something beyond the material, a pursuit that led them from the heights of Victorian prestige to the icy depths of the Atlantic aboard the Titanic, and eventually to the lonely, neglected corridors of Brooke Astor's final days. It is a century-long narrative of how a surfeit of gold can insulate a family from the world while simultaneously suffocating the very humanity it was meant to protect, leaving behind a legacy of hollowed-out monuments and a name that whispers of a lost, unattainable influence. To truly grasp the magnitude of the shadow cast by the Astor bloodline, one must descend into the damp, visceral reality of the late 18th century docks where John Jacob Astor first began his ascent. Unlike the later generations who would inherit polished silver and manicured lawns, the patriarch's hands were stained with the literal blood of the fur trade and the dust of the frontier. His journey from Waldorf, Germany, to the bustling streets of Lower Manhattan was marked by a chillingly pragmatic worldview. He viewed the world as a series of territories to be conquered and resources to be extracted. By the time he established the American Fur Company, Astor had effectively monopolized the North American wilderness, creating a network of agents that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. This was not a venture for the faint of heart, as it involved the systematic exploitation of indigenous populations and the brutal suppression of competitors, establishing a precedent of cold efficiency that would become the family's spiritual hallmark. Yet, Astor's most visionary, and arguably most predatory, move was not in the trade of pelts, but in the acquisition of Manhattan soil. While other merchants speculated on the unpredictable waves of maritime commerce, Astor remained tethered to the land, purchasing vast tracts of farmland in Upper Manhattan that many considered useless at the time. He understood, with a prophetic clarity, that the city was a living organism that would eventually be forced to grow northward, and by holding onto the land rather than developing it, he ensured that every future brick laid in New York would pay tribute to his name. This buy and hold strategy was the birth of the Astor old money ethos. The wealth was not meant to be spent, but to be preserved and grown with a stoic, almost religious fervor. However, This accumulation came at a profound psychological cost to the family's domestic life. John Jacob Astor I was a man who famously calculated his worth down to the last cent even on his deathbed, reportedly complaining about a tenant who owed a few dollars in rent while his own life force flickered out. This obsessive parsimony created an environment where affection was secondary to the ledger. His children, particularly William Backhouse Astor Sr., known as the landlord's landlord, inherited this austere temperament. William did not possess his father's pioneering spirit but far surpassed him in the grim task of maintenance. He spent his days in a sunless office, overseeing the leases of thousands of New Yorkers, many of whom lived in the squalid tenements that the Astors refused to improve, arguing that the land's value lay in its potential, not in the comfort of those who occupied it. This era marked the transition of the Astors from rough-edged traders to a landed gentry that was increasingly detached from the city that fed them. The wealth had become an abstraction, a mountain of gold that required constant guarding, turning the family patriarchs into wardens of their own fortune. As the mid-19th century arrived, the tension between the family's private coldness and their growing public status began to fracture. The emergence of the Astor House Hotel and the Astor Library were attempts to civilize a name that was still associated with the ruthless scent of beaver pelts and slumlordism. Yet, beneath the surface of these philanthropic gestures lay a deep-seated insecurity, a realization that in the fluid society of America, money alone could not buy the historical legitimacy they craved. This insecurity would eventually trigger the most famous social schism in American history, as the next generation sought to use their millions to build a fortress of etiquette so exclusive that it would eventually exclude even members of their own blood. The second half of the 19th century witnessed the transformation of the Astor fortune from a mere hoard of gold into a weapon of social warfare, a period dominated by the towering and formidable presence of Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the woman history remembers simply as the Mrs. Astor. By marrying William Backhouse Astor Jr., she allied the raw, aggressive wealth of the Astor line with her own impeccable Knickerbocker lineage, creating a social force that was both impenetrable and unforgiving. Caroline did not merely live in New York, she dictated its boundaries. From her brownstone mansion at 355th Avenue, she engineered a rigid hierarchy known as the 400. A list supposedly curated by her social gatekeeper Ward McAllister based on the capacity of her ballroom, but in reality, a strategic barricade designed to keep the nouveau riche at bay. This era, while outwardly characterized by magnificent balls, white kid gloves, and the sparkle of the tiara of the Empress Eugenie, was internally defined by a chilling lack of warmth. Caroline's husband, William Jr., largely absented himself from this velvet prison, preferring the solitude of his yacht, the Ambassadress, or the company of his horses, leaving his wife to rule a kingdom of empty ritual. The pressure to maintain this facade of perfection began to warp the family dynamics, as every gesture, every marriage, and every architectural choice became a move in a high-stakes game of prestige. The fragility of this constructed world was exposed by the bitter War of the Houses that erupted between Caroline and her nephew, William Waldorf Astor. The conflict began with a seemingly trivial dispute over whose calling card could claim the title of the Mrs. Astor, but it quickly escalated into a monumental architectural spite match. William Waldorf, feeling slighted by his aunt's social dominance and disgusted by what he perceived as the vulgarity of American life, decided to raze his father's mansion next door to Caroline's and build the massive, towering Waldorf Hotel specifically to overshadow and inconvenience her. In a stroke of retaliatory genius, Caroline eventually moved further uptown to a French Renaissance chateau on 65th Street, allowing her son, John Jacob Astor IV, to build the Astoria Hotel adjacent to his cousins. While the merger of these two structures created the legendary Waldorf Astoria, The original motive was rooted in a profound familial hatred. This rivalry signaled the beginning of the end for the family's American unity. William Waldorf eventually abdicated his American citizenship entirely, moving to England to buy Hever Castle and a viscountcy, famously declaring that America is no longer a fit place for a gentleman to live. This split in the bloodline, one branch clinging to the throne of New York, the other buying its way into the British peerage, marked the moment the Astor influence began to dilute, as the family's vast resources were increasingly spent on escaping their own origins rather than building a future. As the 20th century dawned, the Astor dynasty reached a point of precarious brilliance, personified by John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man in the family and a figure who embodied both the immense potential and the underlying tragedy of his lineage. Known as Jack, he was far more than a mere landlord. He was an inventor, a science fiction novelist, and a decorated colonel who sought to reconcile the cold commercialism of his great-grandfather with a modern, technological vision. However, the weight of the Astor name continued to demand a heavy toll on personal happiness. His scandalous divorce from Ava Lowell Willing and subsequent marriage to the 18-year-old Madeline Force sent shockwaves through the very 400 society his mother had spent a lifetime perfecting. Seeking refuge from the scorching judgment of New York's elite, the couple embarked on an extended honeymoon through Egypt and Europe, a journey that would eventually lead them to the docks of Southampton in April 1912. The decision to book passage on the RMS Titanic was a quintessentially Astor choice, a desire to be aboard the grandest, most technologically advanced vessel ever conceived by man. The sinking of the Titanic remains the most visceral metaphor for the family's encounter with fate. Despite his vast wealth, enough to have bought the ship several times over, John Jacob Astor IV found himself standing on a tilting deck, facing a reality that his gold could not negotiate. Witnesses recalled his calm demeanor as he helped his pregnant wife into a lifeboat, reportedly tucking a leather glove into her hand before being denied entry himself due to the "women and children first" protocol. When his body was recovered days later by the C.S. McKay Bennett, he was identified only by the initials sewn into his jacket and the $2,500 in gold sovereigns in his pocket, a haunting image of wealth rendered utterly useless in the face of the elements. His death was the pivot point for the American branch of the family. The influence that had been built on permanence and land was suddenly decapitated, leaving his son, Vincent Astor, to inherit a world that was rapidly changing. Vincent, unlike his predecessors, felt a deep sense of guilt regarding the source of his wealth, particularly the wretched slums that still bore the Astor name. He began a slow process of liquidation, selling off the family's storied Manhattan holdings and moving the fortune toward philanthropy and media, effectively beginning the dismantling of the physical empire his great-grandfather had died to protect. The mid-20th century marked the transition of the Astor legacy from a tangible empire of brick and mortar into a ghostly presence within the philanthropic and social circles of a world that no longer feared the 400. Vincent Astor, the son of the Titanic's most famous victim, personified this era of quiet retreat. Haunted by the ruthless methods of his ancestors, Vincent dedicated his life to a slow, methodical scrubbing of the family name, selling the notorious tenement blocks that had once been the engine of their wealth and funneling the proceeds into the Vincent Astor Foundation. However, the true final act of the Astor drama was reserved for a woman who was not born into the bloodline, but who would become its most iconic and tragic modern face, Brooke Astor. When she married Vincent in 1953, she entered a world of immense, sterile wealth that felt like a relic of a bygone age. Vincent was a troubled, often morose man, and upon his death in 1959, Brooke was left with a mandate to do good with the remaining Astor millions. She became the First Lady of New York, a vibrant, pearl-adorned figure who visited both the opulent halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the gritty community centers of the Bronx. But as she polished the public image of the dynasty, a private rot was festering within the family's inner sanctum. The final decade of the Astor story is perhaps the most harrowing, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Gilded Age. As Brooke Astor moved into her second century of life, her mind clouded by Alzheimer's, the immense influence she had wielded became a target for those closest to her. The subsequent legal battle and elder abuse scandal involving her only son, Anthony Marshall, stripped away the last vestiges of the family's aristocratic dignity. The woman who had given away nearly $200 million to the city of New York was found living in squalid conditions in her Park Avenue apartment, a victim of the very greed that had founded her fortune 2 centuries prior. The 2009 conviction of Anthony Marshall for grand larceny and scheme to defraud marked the symbolic death of the Astor dynasty. The vast estates were sold, the jewelry auctioned, and the influence that had once dictated the social order of a nation dissipated into a series of foundation reports and historical footnotes. Today, the Astor name survives not as a living power, but as a cautionary tale, a century-long cycle of accumulation and loss that proves that while land can be held for generations, the soul of a family is far more fragile. The mansions are gone, replaced by glass towers, and the dark tale of the Astor bloodline remains a haunting reminder that the greatest fortunes often carry the heaviest shadows.